Old Blood and Guts was the nickname given to General George Patton during the Second World War. Considered the best military figure of the United States in the 20th century, he stood out for decisively crushing the German-Italian Axis forces in the theaters of operation in Africa, Sicily, and Western Europe, as well as for becoming the most charismatic tactical leader on the Allied side. George Smith Patton Jr. was born on November 11, 1885, at the Lake Vineyard Ranch in San Gabriel, California, son of George Smith Patton and Ruth Wilson. Patton's genetics came from a long-standing military tradition present in many of his ancestors, such as his distant grandfather Hugh Mercer, who, during the American War of Independence at the Battle of Princeton in 1777, led a group of rebels until he met his death fighting against the British Army. Also, during the Civil War, members of his family were important figures in the Confederate Army, like George Smith Patton, who led the 12th Virginia Regiment and died in the Battle of Winchester, or Waller Tazewell Patton, who fell at the Battle of Gettysburg. Unlike other children, Patton suffered from childhood dyslexia, which made learning to read and write difficult. As a result, he had to study with a private tutor at home until the age of 11, when he was finally sent to the Stephen Clark School in Pasadena, where he would spend his teenage years. During his school life, he excelled in subjects such as history and in knowledge about great strategists like Scipio Africanus, Julius Caesar, Hannibal Barca, Joan of Arc, Napoleon Bonaparte, and John Mosby. He also became a fan of Greco-Roman heroes featured in works like the Iliad and the Odyssey, and became highly skilled in several sports, such as horseback riding. From a very young age, Patton aspired to be a soldier. That is why in 1902 he did not hesitate to write to a member of the Senate, Thomas Bart, to apply for admission to the United States Military Academy. Unfortunately, during the entrance exam, his score in mathematics was so low that he could not be admitted, so he had to try his luck at the Virginia Military Institute. Once he managed to enter the institution, Patton quickly stood out as a cadet, both in academics and in his strict discipline. In fact, thanks to his impressive resume, in 1904 he was admitted to the prestigious United States Military Academy at West Point, where he proved to be an outstanding student and an excellent fencer, polo player, and football player, though in the latter sport he suffered 3 broken noses and a case of phlebitis. However, his highest achievement up to that point came when he graduated at the top of his class with the rank of Second Lieutenant of Cavalry in 1907. Coincidentally, during a summer vacation on Santa Catalina Island, Patton met the love of his life, Beatrice Banning Ayer, daughter of the wealthy Boston industrialist Frederick Ayer. The two were married on May 26, 1910, at Beverly Farms in Massachusetts. The marriage produced 2 daughters and 1 son, in the following order: Beatrice Smith, Ruth Ellen, and George Patton. Among Patton's first adventures abroad was his participation in the 1912 Olympic Games, held in Stockholm. During his stay in Sweden, he competed in several sports among a group of 42 contestants, achieving the following results: 3rd in equestrian, 9th in fencing, 5th in the 4,000-meter flat race, and 20th in pistol shooting. Simultaneously, as part of the U.S. Army, he earned other sporting honors, such as being named Master of the Sword and inventing the M1913 saber. Thanks to his athletic success in Stockholm, Patton was selected for the 1916 Olympic Games in Mexico, at least until the event was canceled due to the Mexican Revolution led by guerrilla leader Pancho Villa. It was then that the lieutenant would set foot in this same country for a very different reason, as he did so as part of a U.S. military intervention within the 1st Squadron of the 13th Cavalry Regiment under the command of General John Pershing, who sought to eliminate the Mexican communists as revenge for the raid and the murder of civilians in Columbus. Thus, as a member of the so-called Mexican expedition, his first baptism of fire took place on May 14, 1916, when commanding a group of 10 soldiers from the 6th Infantry Regiment mounted in 3 cars. He assaulted an enemy position, shooting 2 Mexican guerrillas with his Colt pistol, one of them being Julio Cardenas, Pancho Villa's personal guard. Surprisingly, and as a self-reward for that victory, Patton carved 2 notches into his ivory-handled pistol, marks that would increase throughout his life. In fact, when General Pershing heard of Patton's feat, he didn't hesitate to declare, "We have a real bandit in our ranks." When the United States entered the First World War against Germany, Patton landed in France in June of 1917 as part of the American Expeditionary Force led by General John Pershing, holding the rank of commander of the new tanks. Patton had long been a strong advocate of tanks, at that time an almost unknown weapon, as a replacement for horses. For that reason, he was given command of the future armored crews in Paris, where, as a guest of honor, he was able to observe the French Army's Renault FT tanks during the Battle of Cambrai. From then on and during the following months, he trained 500 crew members to operate the Renault FTs provided by France, being the only American officer who knew how to drive them before the arrival of the first volunteers. Thus, once the armored forces were ready in August of 1918, under the designation 304th Tank Brigade, Patton led his tanks into battle during the Battle of Saint-Mihiel, a confrontation in which they performed successfully, just as they did later during the Meuse-Argonne offensive. However, in this latter operation, Patton was seriously wounded on September 25th by German fire, when he and a sergeant made the reckless decision to try to take a hill by themselves without any support. A month later, the Great War came to an end. Patton had recovered from his wounds and was awarded the Purple Heart. After the end of the First World War, Patton returned to garrison life in the United States as a captain and instructor at Camp Meade in Maryland in 1919. At this post, all the recruits under his command remembered Patton as an extremely strict leader, a lover of iron discipline who would not tolerate the slightest mistake, more in line with Prussian military culture than the more democratic American one. In fact, unlike many U.S. military men, Patton, like British officers, boasted of his aristocratic origins and forced soldiers to address him accordingly. Faced with such treatment, most of the recruits who served under him described Patton as a disgusting tyrant. Nevertheless, despite the criticism, Patton was the best, and he continued to prove it during the interwar period. During this time, Patton taught in various military posts across the United States, including Fort Myer in 1920 and the Cavalry School at Fort Riley from 1922 to 1923. As a curiosity, that same year, his name gained public attention after he rescued some drowning children while on vacation aboard a luxury yacht anchored in Salem. He also saved the life of a woman who was being abducted by 3 men, whom he bravely threatened with his pistol. The press widely reported both incidents. Starting in 1925, Patton was assigned to the Hawaiian Division at the garrisons in Honolulu on the Hawaiian Islands, where he was responsible for overseeing the island defenses, which he described as poor and ineffective. No one paid attention to his warnings, which would become reality almost 2 decades later with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. However, Patton continued his career by developing concepts for mechanized warfare in the Cavalry Office of the General Staff in Washington, a position he held from 1927 to 1931, where he advocated for the creation of an armored force independent from the infantry. The following year, in 1932, Patton led, alongside General Douglas MacArthur, a contingent of 600 troops against the Bonus Army protesters, mostly veterans of the Great War demanding payment of their pensions. It was a task that deeply upset Patton, as he was forced to use bayonets and tear gas against former comrades along Pennsylvania Avenue. Nevertheless, despite his complaints about the incident, Patton was promoted to lieutenant colonel in 1934 and took command of the Hawaiian Division in 1935. A broken leg in 1937 temporarily sidelined him from military life, until after recovering in 1938, he was given command, now as a general, of the 5th Cavalry Regiment in Texas. With the outbreak of the Second World War in Europe in 1939, Patton was immediately summoned by the 3rd U.S. Army to organize the armored force in preparation for a possible conflict with the Axis powers. Thus, on April 4, 1941, the general was placed in command of the 2nd Armored Division, which at that time had more than 1,000 tanks. While leading this unit, he learned of the United States' entry into the war following Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. From 1942 onward, he began preparing his troops by directing training maneuvers specifically designed for tank crews, which took place in California's Imperial Valley. At the end of that training, Patton addressed his men with the following words: "The object is not to die for your country, but to make the enemy die for his." On November 7, 1942, George Patton was chosen to lead the 2nd Armored Division during Operation Torch against French West Africa and Morocco, which was at the time under the control of Vichy France and therefore aligned with the Axis. Impatient to engage in combat while waiting aboard the cruiser USS Augusta, the bold general made the mistake of ordering the ship to open fire on the Moroccan coast, prompting a retaliatory strike from Vichy coastal batteries. Their response sank several landing craft and killed a small number of American troops. Minutes later, between 8 o'clock and 9 o'clock in the morning, Patton's 33,000 troops landed between Media and Fadala, where for several hours the Vichy French forces resisted the Americans, until Patton broke through the 25 kilometers of enemy defenses, entered Casablanca with his tanks, and brought Morocco under American control. By the end of 1942, however, the U.S. Army in Tunis was defeated in the Battle of Kasserine Pass by the German and Italian armies of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps. As a consequence of this defeat, the man responsible for the tragedy, General Lloyd Fredendall, was relieved of command of the U.S. Second Corps and replaced by the much more promising General Patton, to whom Dwight D. Eisenhower, head of the Allied Expeditionary Forces, entrusted the mission on March 7, 1943. Against all odds and despite tactical inferiority, Patton became the first general of the U.S. Army to defeat the Afrika Korps during the Battle of El Guettar, where the Italo-German forces were driven out of central Tunisia with 6,000 enemy casualties and the loss of 40 tanks, at the cost of 5,000 American casualties and the destruction of 55 tanks. This was a remarkable achievement, considering that the American armored forces were equipped with Sherman and Stuart tanks, both poorly armored, while the Germans had in their ranks the powerful Panzer III, Panzer IV, and the feared Tiger with its 88mm gun. As a result of the events at El Guettar, Patton became known as the new Desert Fox after Rommel, advancing through the sands of the Sahara Desert with astonishing speed, even flying above the dunes in his personal aircraft, the Stinson Voyager. After a series of victories in the Atlas Mountains, his mission concluded with Operation Vulcan and the capture of the port of Bizerte in 1943, an action that ended the Tunisian campaign. So impressed was Patton by this success that he came to believe he was a descendant of Hannibal Barca himself, especially after visiting the ancient battlefield of Zama, where the Carthaginian general was defeated by the Roman general Scipio Africanus in the year 202 BC. When Sicily was invaded by the Allies on July 10, 1943, during Operation Husky, Patton commanded the U.S. 7th Army, which landed along 80 kilometers of the island's southern coast with the objective of taking Gela. For nearly 3 days, Patton led his men in combat within the city and repelled a counterattack involving Tiger tanks, aided by his friend and fellow General Omar Nelson Bradley, who led the U.S. Second Corps together. They formed a formidable tactical duo. At the same time, Patton found himself facing a rival in Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery of the British 8th Army, who had been assigned the task of capturing the port of Messina, a goal he was not in a position to achieve, as British forces had been stalled by the Italian army in the Catania sector. From that moment on, a deep enmity arose, as Montgomery and Patton were two military men destined to clash. The British Field Marshal was cautious, refined, and insecure, while Patton was impatient, bold, and aggressive, qualities that undoubtedly made him the stronger of the two. For that reason, Patton did not hesitate to propose launching an offensive toward Palermo to encircle the Italo-German army from the west, an idea his superior British General Harold Alexander rejected in order to avoid friction between both armies. However, tired of standing idle in Gela, Patton issued the following ultimatum to Alexander. "General, I ask you to take the handcuffs off me and give the order for the 7th Army to advance northward, take Palermo, and cut the enemy in two." Eventually, Alexander had no choice but to agree. Patton flew toward Palermo, occupying the port on July 22nd and capturing 44,000 Italian troops. He then turned east and marched along the northern coast of Sicily in a race against Montgomery to the Strait of Messina. Thus, on August 17th, Patton's tanks triumphantly entered the port of Messina without encountering resistance, just a few hours before Montgomery's armored units could arrive. That victory became one of the happiest moments of Patton's life, not only because he had humiliated Montgomery, but because it marked a significant shift in prestige. For the first time, the United States overtook Great Britain in military reputation within the Allied coalition. As a result of the conquest of Sicily, George Patton became the most celebrated general among the Western Allies, until a foolish incident nearly cost him his career and his reputation. The whole affair took place during one of the phases of the Sicilian campaign, when Patton visited a hospital filled with wounded soldiers near Troina. There, he spent time speaking with and encouraging patients suffering from terribly painful injuries. Just as he was about to leave, he noticed a soldier sitting on a crate near the exit who appeared suspicious. The conversation between the two unfolded as follows. Patton: "What's the matter with you, son?" Soldier: "Nothing. I just can't take it." Patton: "Can't take what?" Soldier: "I can't stand being shot at." Patton: "Are you saying you're here to avoid doing your duty?" Furious at the soldier's words, Patton shouted at him, accused him of being a coward, and slapped him on the helmet with his glove. The scolding had an effect. The soldier regained his courage, left the hospital, took up a weapon, and returned to the front, where he fought bravely. Curiously, the incident could have ended there, but somehow word reached General Dwight Eisenhower. Hoping to avoid public controversy, Eisenhower ordered Patton to apologize to the soldier, to the hospital staff who had witnessed the event, and to his divisional commanders. However, journalist Drew Pearson got wind of what had happened and reported it on the radio to the American public. The scandal was so great that many newspapers in the United States called for Patton's resignation, and a senator in Washington even demanded that he be court-martialed. Thousands of parents of American soldiers began to fear that military officers were mistreating their sons. Faced with this exaggerated public reaction, Eisenhower relieved Patton of his general rank for a full year, a punishment that would turn out to be one of the greatest strategic mistakes made by the Allies and a huge gift to the Third Reich. When the invasion of Italy took place, a campaign that Patton himself should have led, every general who participated performed incompetently. They suffered defeat after defeat and left the Italian peninsula front stalled almost until the end of the war in Europe. Between late 1943 and early 1944, Patton remained inactive in Britain, giving lectures and interviews, not without continuing to stir controversy, especially with his anti-communist remarks directed at the Soviet Union, then still a U.S. ally, or his behavior during an event in Corsica that he attended alongside the Free French. However, his favorite activity at the time was walking his dog, Guillermito, named in honor of Prince Wilhelm, proudly showing him off at all public events. Meanwhile, General Eisenhower, well aware that keeping Patton idle was a mistake, kept an ace up his sleeve. During the first half of 1944, he appointed Patton commander of a non-existent armored army in England, a fake force composed of inflatable rubber tanks. This elaborate deception successfully convinced the Germans that the bold general would be leading the invasion of Europe through the Pas de Calais. Patton's decoy, codenamed Operation Fortitude, worked perfectly because on the day of the Normandy invasion, the sector it targeted was lightly defended, allowing the Allies to advance into the interior of France. After the deception succeeded and nearly a year had passed since his punishment, Eisenhower called Patton back into service in the summer of 1944. General George Patton was sent to the Western Front, commanding the 3rd United States Army in Normandy, under the command of the 12th Army Group, led by General Omar Bradley, his old friend from Africa and Sicily, now his superior in rank. As soon as Patton took control of his troops, he broke through the German lines at Avranches, isolated a significant German force in Brittany, and neutralized the naval base at Brest. He then turned his tanks back towards Normandy in what became known as Operation Cobra, trapping 60,000 Germans in the Falaise pocket, who eventually surrendered to the Allies. Interestingly, this was Patton's most impressive victory to date, and he once again humiliated Montgomery, whom he had to rescue from a stalemate during the Battle of Caen. Following these events, Patton praised the fighting spirit of his men with the words, "They are sons of bitches commanded by the greatest son of a bitch," referring to himself. After the Normandy campaign ended, General Patton advanced without permission towards the border of the Third Reich. At Verdun, however, his tanks ran out of fuel because Generals Dwight Eisenhower and Omar Bradley sabotaged his advance to prevent him from making a suicidal mistake. Furious at this, Patton accused his superiors of favoring Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery at his expense, which caused yet another controversy. As he himself stated, "If you had let me continue, I would have ended the war in 10 days." Although he didn't reach the Rhine, Patton settled for advancing into Lorraine, penetrating the Franco-German province and capturing the impregnable fortress of Metz on November 23rd after 2 months of intense fighting in the forests. In December 1944, the German army launched its last major offensive, known as the Battle of the Bulge, breaking the Western Front through Belgium and Luxembourg, destroying several enemy divisions. After routing the American army and trapping the 101st Airborne Division in Bastogne, with little hope of saving the situation, Eisenhower turned to Patton, the only man who could change things. When asked how many weeks it would take him to intervene, as he first needed to reorganize his retreating forces, Patton replied to Eisenhower's complete astonishment, "Now." And that happened because immediately Patton's armored forces set out towards the Ardennes despite having everything against them. The superior mechanization of the German forces, the snowstorm that prevented air support, and one of Germany's best military leaders directing the opponents, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt. The advance was extremely difficult since the snowstorms left Patton with no visibility on the terrain, and German ambushes through the forests caused him many casualties. To make matters worse, supplies didn't arrive on time, and the soldiers had to advance for 2 days without rest and barely any food. Without a doubt, this was the first time Patton found himself in serious trouble, on the real brink of defeat, until the general, who was a devout Christian, had the idea to call his chaplain, James O'Neill, and ordered him to pray to God for the clouds to clear within 24 hours. Surprisingly, the next day dawned completely sunny, which earned Chaplain O'Neill a medal for his good relations with God. Following this, the tanks resumed their march, and aircraft bombed the German positions. Thus, at 4:50 p.m. on December 26th, Patton entered Bastogne with his tanks, lifting the siege on the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division. As a result of this impressive military feat, Patton himself called his army the best in the world. At the beginning of 1945, General Omar Bradley ordered George Patton to entrench the Third Army defensively along the Siegfried Line, the powerful fortification that separated Germany from Belgium. However, since Patton detested immobility, he recommended to his friend that it would be more useful to take the strategic city of Trier, something Bradley refused, arguing that at least 4 divisions were necessary. Nevertheless, Patton ignored this and launched an assault on Trier, conquering the city with only 2 divisions. When he called headquarters to report what happened, he explained, "I took Trier with 2 divisions. What should I do? Give it back to the Germans?" Germany was Patton's next destination, where with his Third Army he crossed the Siegfried Line and expanded his divisions over the Palatinate, Eifel, Alsace, and the Saar like domino pieces. The important cities of Trier, Koblenz, Bingen, Worms, Mainz, Kaiserslautern, and Ludwigshafen fell into his hands, while on the 22nd of March he became the first Allied general to cross the Rhine River by means of an improvised bridge that he ordered his engineers to build, leaving behind 37,000 isolated German soldiers. In fact, once he reached the other shore, he wrote to his friend Bradley, mocking him, "Brad, tell everyone. I want the whole world to know that the Third Army crossed the Rhine before Montgomery." After achieving this triumph and during his subsequent advance, Patton accomplished another of his greatest feats by capturing 82,000 German prisoners at the cost of only 1,043 of his own casualties. However, the best came in April of 1945, when his vanguards converged on the industrial Ruhr Basin, trapping 400,000 German soldiers who surrendered with barely any resistance. That impressive victory in the Ruhr made Patton the Allied general who captured the most enemy troops in a single battle during World War II. Patton's final campaign was his rapid advance of 50 kilometers per day toward the Elbe River in Bavaria, conquering 84,860 square kilometers of German territory and inflicting on the German army a total of 20,100 dead, 47,700 wounded, and 653,140 prisoners at the cost of only 2,020 American deaths, 7,954 wounded, and 91 missing. Next, Patton's Third Army penetrated Czechoslovakia, occupied western Bohemia, and after a brief battle, captured the city of Pilsen on the 6th of May. Unfortunately, he was not allowed to invade the capital, Prague, as the Washington government had agreed with the Kremlin in Moscow that the Red Army would be the one to take the city. This decision led Patton to accuse the high command of the General Staff of being infiltrated by communists. Nevertheless, despite this frustrated attempt to reach Prague, the general could feel proud, because from his arrival in Africa to his halt in Pilsen, his forces had conquered 210,000 square kilometers of enemy territory. Once World War II in Europe ended in June of 1945, Patton requested Eisenhower to send him to the Pacific Front to fight against the Japanese Empire. However, the High Command refused to grant him this wish and instead appointed him provisional head of the government of Bavaria. During his stay in German territory, Patton authorized certain localities to retain former officials of the National Socialist German Workers' Party in office, arguing that these former governors were the ones who best understood the situation of their country and were the most reliable in the upcoming fight against communism. Precisely because of his public statements against the Soviet Union, including a verbal altercation with Russian Marshal Georgy Zhukov, and other controversies in which he described Jews as lower than animals and equated the Democratic and Republican parties of the United States with the Nazis, he drew intense criticism. Patton was dismissed from command by Eisenhower on the 7th of October 1945. Relieved of the leadership of the Third Army, Patton spent a few days touring Europe, visiting cities such as Paris, Rennes, Chartres, Reims, Verdun, Metz, Brussels, and Stockholm. It was then that Eisenhower requested his services once more, granting him command of the Fifth Army, a secondary force assigned to oversee the denazification of Germany. Feeling humiliated by the position, which he ultimately accepted, Patton wrote to his wife expressing his intention to retire before Christmas arrived. Unexpectedly, on the 9th of December 1945, while Patton was traveling aboard his Jeep with another general, he was involved in an accidental collision with a truck driven by Sergeant Robert Thompson. The crash caused him severe neck fractures. Completely paralyzed and unable to move, he was transferred to the hospital in Heidelberg, where doctors diagnosed him with irreversible spinal cord damage. From that moment on, and for nearly 2 weeks, Patton endured intense pain. He was accompanied by his family, who had traveled from the United States so he would not be alone, and he received various treatments that had no effect whatsoever. Curiously, although he occasionally seemed to improve, the doctors were ultimately unable to save his life. A pulmonary edema was found, which worsened his condition. At 6 o'clock on the 21st of December 1945, Patton died of a heart attack. His final wish was to be buried on the battlefield alongside his men. For that reason, he was taken to the cemetery in Ham, Luxembourg, a town that 1 year earlier had witnessed Patton's armored onslaught during his counteroffensive in the Battle of the Bulge, and so extroverted and controversial until the very end, with countless notches on his ivory-handled pistol and convinced that he had embodied mythical heroes in past lives, George Patton would go down in history as the greatest general of the Allied side during World War II, and also the most brilliant of the United States of America.